Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share my full review, the digitally digested segment for the Sony a6600. Now I've got several cameras out here. I've got the a6300 and the a6500, and these are the only mirrorless APS-C cameras I have from Sony at present, outside of the 6600 that I've been reviewing. Now the 6600 is a marked improvement from both of these cameras, no question about that. The question remains, is it enough to justify its $1,400 US price point? That's for body alone. These are two far less expensive cameras. The 6500 selling for a little under $1,000 US. That's $100 more than the newer 6400, but that's because the 6500 did originally maintain a higher position in the pricing pyramid, which the a6600, of course, takes over from the 65, and then the 6300 is positioned right under the 64, and it very much like the 6400 has many of the features of the 6500 but no in-body image stabilization, which is what the 6400 that's missing from this picture is all about. Now I do not have the 6400, but I did review it earlier this year. It's a good camera, no question about it, and more of you out there are going to be drawn to it at its lower $899 price point versus, again, the $1,400 a6600. But the 6600, I have to say, is the best mirrorless camera in the APS-C realm that I've had the pleasure of using. And I call it a pleasure because it really is. The first thing you'll notice, the grip. On both of these cameras, the 6500 and the 6300, a smaller profile, no question about it. The 6600 builds upon the form factor of these two, makes it more ergonomic, in part because it now sports a Z-type battery, something that I've been waiting for a long time from Sony in the APS-C space, which means if you missed my previous updates on this camera, we have twice the battery life inside the 6600 that we have with these cameras or the 6400. And while that may not seem like a big deal, trust me, it is, especially if you want to carry less. After all, the whole premise of these smaller form factor cameras and what keeps them alive are people who do not necessarily want to carry around full frame cameras or full frame glass. Now, remember, Sony E-mount full frame glass will work on all of these cameras in a crop mode. So I always will recommend picking up full frame lenses. In fact, the one mounted to the 66 right now is the Zeiss 55mm f1.8, which is one of the original full frame lenses and a bargain in my opinion, if you're interested in that prime position that it gives you at 55mm. Now, of course, on the 6600, you have the crop factor. It's not a 55mm lens, but it's still a very fast piece of glass. And if you're looking to get the fastest glass you can, the full frame options are where it's at. Now, Sony did just release, of course, a great zoom lens in tandem with the 6600, which I highly recommend based on what I've seen. I have not had a chance to use it, but literally every review out there is pretty much glowing for that zoom lens. And if I was picking up the 6600 tomorrow and I had no E-mount glass, that's probably the one APS-C lens outside of the 10 to 18 f4 that would be absolute purchases for me. Now, that new zoom lens is not inexpensive. It is expensive, but it covers pretty much the entire range that anyone's going to want without getting to telephoto or wide angle. And it starts at 16 millimeters, so it is wide, really, even though there's, again, a crop factor there, even though it is a native APS-C lens. You have to bear that in mind. And again, it's an expensive piece of glass, but the 6600 has so much going for it. You know, between, as I mentioned, the battery life, we now have a microphone and headphone jack. We also have, of course, the LCD screen that fully articulates so that if you want to vlog, you can. Self-framing is possible with this. You also have, in addition to that, no record limitations on 4K video. So if you want to record an hour, you can do it. Overheating, excuse me, not really an issue with the a6600. With the 65 and 63, you will encounter it. I'm not going to say it's not possible for the 6600 to overheat, because it is. I'll never forget in the desert in the Middle East, I had overheating issues with all of my cameras. So bear in mind that when I say overheating is less likely, that's what I mean. It doesn't mean it can't happen. So beyond that, We have aspect ratios that have been added to this that did not live in either of these cameras. Most importantly, though, is the improvement in the autofocus system. Now, the general autofocus capability doesn't blow these two cameras out of the water. In fact, these are still very relevant, and I think coming into the holiday season, these are both great options. You save money, you can invest it in glass, accessories, whatever it may be. You're going to need to pick up extra batteries, of course, if you want to match what this camera is capable of. But all of that aside, the 6600, with all of its new features, the new Wi-Fi capability, I wish they had added Type-C here. They didn't. That would have been, I think, a great addition to this piece of hardware, because overall, this right now is just the most robust in terms of feeling, in terms of ergonomics, in terms of feature set. And even though the sensor is still 24 megapixels like it is in both of these cameras, I mean, they did take the A6500 and make a marked improvement here with the 6600. Now, I would not begin to tell you the 6600 will blow away the 6400, because the key difference really is that in-body image stabilization, which, if it's important to you, then you have to pick one of these two cameras. I mean, as long as you want to stay in the APS-C realm. If you're willing to go full frame, you can pick up something like the A7R Mark II. I have that here too. And, you know, I have done a comparison of these two as well. And the A7R II, I still think, is an amazing full frame camera. But if you're trying to keep things light, this is not the way to go. In fact, every person who says, why buy this, the A6600, when you can buy an A7 Mark III, what if a person doesn't want the added size of full frame? Now, if full frame's size, the body, the lenses don't matter to you at all, then yes, I recommend going down the pathway to full frame. But the real-time tracking in the autofocus system here that doesn't exist on either of these cameras or in the A7R Mark II is really significant if you're a video shooter. However, these all are still cameras first, especially the brand new A6600. So if still is all you're after, then the eye autofocus is really the big improvement here, besides battery life. And of course, as I keep mentioning, both the headphone and microphone jack combo that doesn't exist on any other camera in the APS-C lineup. We do lose the flash here. You've got a flash on both of the previous models that are side by side, and that's a big deal to me. I mean, for me personally, it's not a make or break, but for many of you out there, you're accustomed to having a flash on board the APS-C bodies. That's another thing you will not get if you go full frame, and I feel like that was a luxury that, you know, A6000 users were accustomed, that Sony stripped from this. And that's a sign to me that they are looking to make this a more pro-grade body. So I wouldn't be shocked, and I say this over and over again, if we see an A7000 in the near future that will give us a lot of the things that are missing from this camera and differentiate it enough to make it a $1,700 body, for example, or at least $1,699, possibly more. That would be where people would really start to say, A7 Mark III, why even bother? But again, they miss the point, which is that if you want the smallest, highest quality camera that you can get, that's not what the the A7 III is. That's where the A6000 line comes into play. So 11 frames per second, if they can improve what we have here, because that's what we also get from the previous gen, but if they can bump that up to 15 frames per second, throw in, you know, UHS 2 card slot, at least one, and side mount it, relocate the record button somewhere over here like they have with their full frame bodies and the RX10 lineup, I think that throwing in another dial on the top of the camera for more customized controls, I think that's the direction that the A6600 has to go in, besides getting a new sensor, which is generally the biggest complaint from users out there. And then I think the A7000 exists. I mean, but again, the A6600 today in 2019, here towards the end, holiday season, it's going to come out at the end of the month, November 29th. We're almost there. And I really can't see, if I didn't own any other mirrorless Sony cameras, I would be going to the A6600. Now, it is pricey. I mean, I've gone over the price for each of these and the A6400, and that leaves the 6600 at a very lofty price point. But it is also the only camera of its kind. I don't mean the sensor, but I do mean the combination of the autofocus, in-body image stabilization, battery life, no limit on 4K video. And yes, you can get around the limitations of 4K video on these cameras, but not everyone wants essentially a way to cheat the system. They want it to be built in. They want to know that the manufacturer is putting their blessing on 4K recording without limitations. And I think that's important. I know many of you out there will say, Ed, I can just do that with the Open Memories workaround. That's not for the general public. You can do that at your own wish, desire, but a lot of people, myself included, want to see Sony make cameras like this that are beefier, but not to the point where I am going to start saying, this is what I'm interested in. Because at that point, it doesn't make any sense, obviously, to be looking at an APS-C offering. I also want to see them somehow get this EVF off of the far left, but now with the flip around screen becoming standard on this, which of course doesn't live on either of these, I don't see that happening. So if they can just bump up the resolution, that would be nice. The LCD is an improvement. The touchscreen functionality is an improvement. I'm going to go ahead and jump us into the menu system. And there's not a hell of a lot for me to show you in the menu system, but I'm going to anyway, just so you get an idea. Let's get it off body. And, you know, again, I think that most of the criticism of this camera is, I'm not going to say undue, because it's justified. I mean, a lot of people were looking for a brand new piece of hardware, and they're not getting it here. So I completely understand frustration with that. But that doesn't mean that the a6600 isn't a great camera. And in my experience, it is a great camera. I've had no issues, no manufacturer's defects, not that I've had them with other Sony cameras, but this has just been a pleasure to shoot with. And it reminds me, again, that even though a lot of people out there, reviewers, aren't looking at this as an innovative model, I beg to differ. The fact that we didn't have something like this until this is about to come out, that's still innovation. It's not revolutionary, but it's innovative nonetheless, because if this could be the camera that I travel with in place of a full frame without saying, oh, I wish I had the dynamic range, this is where I'd be going. And God knows that if you have back problems or anything like that, this is a dream. And this also, I think, is really appealing to people who love the RX 100 series like myself, but are looking for a little bit more. And look out, at my comparison of this with the RX 100 Mark VII, because that's another really relevant comparison, in my opinion, when you're talking about just the money that you're shelling out on something like this. So, back in the menu, I was talking so long we lost it. So, of course, file format, you have the same options pretty much that you would generally speaking. JPEG quality, nothing new to see here, right? The image size, also nothing new. And yes, I think it would be nice to have a 32 megapixel sensor, but I also don't think it's the difference between this camera being great and garbage. So aspect ratio, yes, we have some new aspect ratios, which is nice. Color space, you've got the latest color science, which if you are shooting with an A7R4, then this is a great B camera to have that same color science. In terms of other things, your drive mode, interval shooting function. This is something I want to see them integrate through firmware to things like my RX10. The other day we got an update, but they did not bring this. I think it's good that they have this. I kind of miss Play Memories, but the majority of the market doesn't. And I'm just going to, jump us through. This is not really anything new. I mean, that's the other thing I would address. I feel like it's time for Sony to revamp the menu system. But I think they're worried about doing that, because if they revamp the menu system, it may not net as much compliments, as many stellar reviews, as it will frustration from experienced Sony shooters that all of a sudden are relearning what they've already been trained on for many, many years. But I think overall, the majority of users will wholeheartedly welcome a refresh in the menu system if it equates to a better menu system. So I'm on board for that. If they can deliver something new, that's the time to do it. And I'm surprised no one is mentioning that, because that's what I really would have expected to see here. On the video side, you can see, of course, 4K. If you want to use the Super 35, of course, you're going to have to live in the 24p realm. No options with that. Your S&Q settings, if that's your thing. It's nice that the screen will stay fully, the brightness will stay full now through the 120 frames per second. You cannot do that with the older A6500. So bear that in mind. Let's go ahead and jump back. Your drive speed, I mean, all of these things, your initial focus, magnification, slow shutter, your audio levels. I mean, it's all there. Marker settings, electronic front curtain shutter, steady shot. It's all here. I mean, this is not new stuff. Your custom key control, so you can set that so it's the way you prefer. I mean, these are all of the things we've come to expect. It's nothing new. And this is where I do wish that we saw something else, as I've already stated. As I mentioned, the Wi-Fi performance is superior on this model, which is a big deal. There's been Wi-Fi on board these cameras for so many years, but anytime that I go to use it, I'm kind of turned off. This camera, it's an improvement, just like it is on the full frame latest offerings, and that's definitely a nice thing. Beyond that, not much left in the menus to show all of you. And what it really boils down to is you either value the set of specifications and qualities that this camera brings to the table, or saving money is your priority. And there's nothing wrong with saving money. And I will agree that this camera at $1,400, the reason it's drawing so many comparisons that I'm not going to call arbitrary, but don't necessarily leverage the true merit of this DI hardware, is because of its price. If this price was lower, if this was a $1,200 body, I don't think anybody would be bitching it out. That's just a matter of fact. I think if it was $1,200 for the body, and by the way, it will get to $1,200, everybody would be complimenting it and saying it's a great buy at $1,200, because why on earth would you look at the $6,500 for $200 less? Why would you look at the $6,400 for $300 less? You wouldn't. This would be an instant buy. And there still would be other price points, so that if this was still too expensive at $1,200, Sony would forgo it. Now, also try to remember, this $1,400 price point, I think, is higher than it would have been. And I don't blame Sony for this, not because I'm excusing them, but if you've missed it, all of their camera prices have gone up, and I don't think that's a gouge on consumers. It happened across the board. I think that's because of you-know-who. The man who I shall not mention. He gets enough press coverage as is. And I think that if we weren't in a trade war with China, we likely wouldn't be seeing these inflated prices. I mean, literally every camera just about that Sony makes went up in price this year. Only in the last 3 months did that happen, or 2.5. I mean, so, the RX 100 Mark VII was not $1,300 at launch. It was, $1,200. It was maintaining the existing pricing structure that Sony has had throughout the years. But now, with the trade wars, this has become more expensive, and no one's talking about that. And I think that $100 difference that it likely is sitting at would make a big difference in sales. Even though I've said the number I would personally like to see is $1,200, I think that even if it had come out at $1,300, it would be getting less criticism, because the sum of this device, of its parts, is really that it does render all of the other APS-C offerings kind of irrelevant. You don't need to look at them because it's got everything. Now, does it change the game? No. Improved battery life, improved tracking, those are great things. But there are plenty of people that are going to say, I'm a landscape shooter. I don't need the improved tracking because I don't care about video. But if you care about the hybrid experience, if you care about vlogging, having what this camera puts together amounts to a lot more than any other APS-C offering. And I know there are a lot of Fuji lovers out there, and there's nothing wrong with loving, their latest and greatest. But the reality is that, I mean, if we really want to get into the quality of that camera, it has shortcomings. It's not perfect, So, in my opinion, the A6600 is also not perfect, but it's got a lot going for it. And while, it doesn't change the game, it changes the APS-C space. And then the beautiful thing is, at least in my experience of shooting with this camera, is I bring in something like this, okay? Which a lot of people see me bring this out in my videos. This is not a lens that gets a lot of love. After all, it's the kit lens for Sony's pro-grade video production cameras, and it's already been supplanted by a Super 35. But I love this because you have both full frame and Super 35 performance with a servo, and the range on it being 28 to 135 is fantastic. Now, is it lopsided with this? Sure it is. I mean, this is lopsided on my A7R3, A7R2, on the A7R4 that I demoed. It's still a very big lens. But if I then bring out something like this, the G Master 100 to 400, now we're really talking, yes, again, very lopsided, but with something like this, you really can get great reach because remember, that's cropped. So realistically, you're going to be looking at a lot more reach with this on board. And I have to tell you that when I've shot with this lens on other APS-C cameras, the grip was inadequate. This is still small, but it's big enough that I can shoot with this now. That makes a big difference to me. That makes this a tool that I actually would want to pair with this $2,500 piece of glass. I can't say that about many other, if actually zero, APS-C cameras. That includes the A6400 that so many people love dearly. And the in-body image stabilization, no matter how many people out there knock it, the truth of the matter is that if you use any legacy glass, if you use any glass that's not stabilized, you want that. You want the extra steps. It's critical. It's not about replacing a gimbal for still photography. And on the video side, it's helpful as well. So there's really no downside to having that in-body image stabilization except for cost. So I really like this camera. I think that Sony's got it right. I think the next APS-C body will probably be that revolutionary step where we get a new sensor. As I mentioned, an improved EVF. I would like to see a UHS slot on there, a UHS 2, excuse me, at least one, Sony, if you're listening. It doesn't have to be two. If you can fit two, great. I think this desire to have two on board is a little lofty because people are forgetting this is a small camera. If they're going to put two ports on there, you're asking them to grow it even more. I don't want to see this thing balloon so that then I'm going to be back to let's stick with full frame because APS-C no longer makes sense. I don't want to have that become the evolution of Sony's DI business. And I want to see them keep putting money into the APS-C space because it still has a place in my bag. And I think for many of you out there, it may be your primary, your go-to. So too expensive? Yeah, they went a little bit beyond what they probably should have. But considering the amount of competition being one camera, which I'm not reviewing today, and if Fuji wants to send it to me, sure, I will. But if that's the only camera to look at besides this, and if your answer is, well, I could just go full frame, of course you can go full frame. And there are advantages, but there are disadvantages too. And in my mind, the whole premise of going with APS-C is defeated by transitioning to full frame. That doesn't mean over time you may outgrow it or, your budget allows you to go full frame. But if you don't need full frame, I don't know why you would do it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So everyone's saying, forget this, go A7 III. No, I would wait or just save the money and go to, something else that does make sense for you economically and from a need standpoint, because there's no reason to go bigger if you don't need it. There's no reason to spend more on lenses if you don't need it. And there is still something to be said for keeping APS-C, APS-C. I mean, the new zoom lens, still the good old 10 to 18 f4. I think that's probably a good enough pairing to cover just about anything else. And then if you do want to splurge, if you do want to prepare to transition to full frame, buy full frame glass. Now, the majority of my glass these days is full frame. And there's a reason. It's because Sony kind of gave up on APS-C for a while. And, I've been in the full frame world for many years. So it made sense. I've been with Sony on full frame since their first, A7, A7R. And they've been great. They've improved every single generation. This is not a new generation, but it is a new level of capability in the APS-C world. And I think that deserves merit. Does it deserve $1,400? Again, if you've got the budget and you haven't purchased any gear in Sony's, again, their pyramid of mirrorless, then I would say the 6600 is the way to go. If you want the best, that's what you're getting. And everyone who says it's not enough, those are people working from an angle that they already have a camera or they already have their sights set on something else, and more power to you. It means you know what you want. That's a good thing. But for all the people who are unsure, this checks pretty much every box. So if the only thing we could talk about is that it doesn't have a new sensor that's better, which is a big deal. Don't for a second think I don't think it is. It is. But outside of that, I mean, wishing that it had 10-bit, 4K capable of 60p, that's totally unrealistic. We don't have that in the brand new A7R IV or A9 Mark II, which I should be getting hopefully soon for review. So to expect that sort of video performance out of this, you've lost your mind. I mean, that's just, it's not happening. It's, let me rephrase it for the sensitive people out there. It's unrealistic. Sony is still in this for profit, and as much as they like to make digital imaging dreams come true, there are still limitations, even for Sony. And the a6600, I really think, is a great camera. And if I had to pick one APS-C camera right now, this would be it. If budget is my issue, then the a6400 probably is the next best choice if you don't care about in-body image stabilization. But if you do, 6500, it's going to be even pushed down more so in terms of pricing. It will get softer, and that will make everyone's decision all that much more simple, in my opinion. And if budget is your real driving force, you know, the 6100 is out, and the 6300, although it's old, is still a great camera. The autofocus system is right there close. Again, the 65 and 63 are not as close to the 6600 as, you know, they could be, but they're still close enough that you have competent, solid autofocus capability. You just don't have the real-time tracking. And if you really just need the real-time tracking, the 6400 is still a more affordable option. But that pretty much rounds it out. I think Sony did a good job here. Yes, there's room for improvement, but this is kind of typical of what Sony does in improving their APS-C cameras and their full frame. We don't get a new world every year or every 2 years. We get steps. And again, this is not revolutionary, but evolutionary. And it is setting up, in my opinion, revolutionary, because now that we have the new battery type and we have the LCD that fully articulates and we have no record limit anymore. I mean, years ago, if I would have told you you were going to have no record limit on a Sony APS-C camera, people would have gone berserk. Now, that's all crap. It's meaningless, overpriced junk. And I don't get that. It's like they've lost their way. And the reality is, this is still, in my opinion, the best mirrorless APS-C camera on the market. And if you don't want to go full frame, look no further. The a6600's got your back. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.